Members of Congress are calling the influx of Chinese fentanyl an act of asymmetric war against the United States. The Drug Enforcement Agency estimates 90% of fentanyl comes from Chinese companies that not only operate legally inside of China, but are also subsidized and paid for by the Chinese Communist Party. China sends precursor chemicals, which are then processed and manufactured into synthetic opioids by Mexican drug cartels that then smuggle them into the United States.
Fentanyl precursor chemicals are made in China.
It is not at all an area of dispute that China provides the fentanyl that comes into the United States.
On the other hand, China claims the fentanyl crisis is entirely an American domestic issue that's being blamed on them. China claims Big Pharma's opioid corruption, weak US laws, and a culture of American drug glorification are really to blame. This disagreement is a major problem for the world's two biggest economies. Attempts to stop this have failed, leading to calls for US military intervention against Mexican cartels to stop the substance's devastating effects.
Growing calls from Republicans to send the US military into Mexico to combat drug cartels.
For example, in 2022, over 107,000 Americans died from overdoses in the United States, and fentanyl poisoning became the leading cause of death of Americans 18 to 45 years of age. A 2019 paper found that prescription opioids accounted for 44% of the decline in labor force participation among men. In asymmetric warfare, one nation seeks to exploit the other's relative weakness. In this case, China's accused of exploiting America's appetite for illicit drugs and weaponizing fentanyl. When US President Donald Trump and China's President Xi Jinping engaged in an all-out trade war in 2018, the Chinese government then increased tax breaks and subsidized companies that were exporting fentanyl abroad to punish the United States. When Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in 2022, against China's wishes, they stopped all cooperation between Chinese and US law enforcement agencies that were working to fight fentanyl trafficking. It's clear the fentanyl crisis has become deeply ingrained in foreign diplomacy today. But the idea of weaponizing substances against an adversary is nothing new. Because if there was ever a country to understand the power of addiction in geopolitics, it's China. Qin Gang, China's former ambassador to the United States, said, quote, "The Opium War started a century of humiliation for China. Some Americans believe that China is the primary source of fentanyl in the United States. Some even fantasize that China's shipping fentanyl to the United States as a form of payback for the Opium Wars, and that North America has been flooded with precursor chemicals from China, stifling international efforts. The theory is that China is using the same tactic that was used against them, but now they're turning it against the West. Over 170 years ago, in the mid-19th century, the Opium Wars led to what China calls their Century of Humiliation, that they claim only ended in 1949, except in the Opium Wars the roles were reversed. At the time, the United States, Great Britain, and France found themselves going crazy over Chinese tea and silk. But Britain ran into a problem. They started running low on silver necessary to pay for these exotic goods. The British turned to their Indian colony and said, hey, how about you guys produce opium, a highly addictive drug, and then we can trade it to China for all these sweet, sweet tea leaves and silk. Selling opium probably wasn't initially designed to create an epidemic in China, but instead it was probably a method to restore the balance of trade back in Europe's favor. It's like a history lesson on how not to win friends and influence people. Opium smuggled by the British and American traders skyrocketed in the mid-1800s. Massive amounts of Chinese silver was flowing out of their country to the West to pay for opium. At its peak, 13.5 million Chinese out of 400 people in their population were hooked. Or to put it more bluntly, 25% of the country's males were spending all their time smoking in an opium den. At that point, it becomes difficult to raise an army or increase your economy's productivity because everyone is too busy chasing that big old red opium dragon. Opium had become an existential threat to China. What followed is an interesting parallel to the debate occurring in the US political system today. Because the Chinese government debated whether or not they should try to profit off the opium themselves and legalize the drug through a government monopoly like they had with salt, which they could barter, or if they should make it outright illegal. China passed laws banning narcotics and told foreign sellers if they didn't stop, they'd be punished under Chinese law. Seeing the social and economic degradation that widespread opium addiction was having in the society, the Chinese emperor confiscated and destroyed more than 20,000 chests of opium. Some 1,400 tons of the drug were warehoused at Canton by British merchants. This led to Britain launching the First Opium War. According to the first-hand reports written in 1847, about 19,000 British ground troops fought on Chinese soil in the city of Zhenjiang, defeating the Qin dynasty in 1842. Even though China outnumbered Britain with 100,000 soldiers, Western military weapons and technology were far superior. This included precision-lock muskets, heavy artillery, and paddle-wheel gunboats. Add to that the fact that British troops had far more combat experience from fighting in recent Napoleonic wars. It gave them an edge in the battle. Britain was able to wage war 4,800 miles away from home, thanks to advanced warships and logistical resupply from nearby colonies in Southeast Asia and India. It was this pre-positioning of supplies and combat power that resulted in a disaster for the Chinese forces. China had 7,000 casualties to Britain's less than 3,000. This resulted in the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, and it gave Britain control of Hong Kong, which has had ripple effects seen to this day. The First and Second Opium Wars spanned nearly 2 decades, where Britain and France won decisive victories. China calls this today the century of humiliation. From their perspective, these treaties were unfair. This concept is key to understanding China's perspective today because this history underscores the devastating consequences of weaponizing drugs as a tactic, which should tell us how important it is to address the fentanyl crisis today. One historian even called this time period China's treaty century, because each loss meant that they were forced to make major concessions to foreign countries like France, England, and Russia. The treaties made the opium trade legal and allowed foreign nationals in China to be immune from Chinese laws. Many of these treaties weren't voided until 1943, so it's not like this is distant history for China. The United States did participate in the opium trade, and they benefited from these trade negotiations signed as a result of the wars. It's likely impossible for China to have not learned from this traumatic experience from their point of view, the power of weaponizing addiction for political gain and economic profit. The opium trade in China hit its peak in 1906. At the time, 35,000 tons were grown domestically, and an extra 4,000 tons of opium were brought in imported from abroad. A massive percentage of their population was addicted. So how did China manage to free their population from drug addiction for a period of time? Is there anything at all of use that we could potentially learn from this on how to manage our own drug crisis today? Well, maybe not, because when the Chinese Communist Party took control in 1949, they burned it down. They burned it all down, specifically the opium fields and all of their drug addicts. Dictator Mao Zedong used unrestrained repression and social reform to eradicate any signs of opium. More than 800 traffickers were put to death, and many were sent to prison for life. 10 million addicts were forced into compulsory treatment and punished by the government if they didn't follow through. By 1953, only 5 years after taking control, the communist leadership announced that China was drug-free thanks to these draconian measures. This historical example demonstrates the extremes to which a government can go when combating a drug crisis, and the potential consequences for civil liberties and human rights. I think this is a possible foreshadowing of what could be to come for any country that isn't able to resolve a drug crisis that runs out of control. If it becomes a threat to the country and the citizens' well-being, they will ask for harsh authoritarian measures to solve problems that run out of control. But what does this have to do with the situation today? Considering all that history of how terrible China feels they've been treated after their losses in the Opium Wars, is it possible that they engineered this recent fentanyl crisis inside the United States as some form of payback? Well, it's not that straightforward, because there were actually 2 parallel developments in China and the United States that created a perfect storm of conditions for the opium epidemic to emerge. First, fentanyl wasn't created by drug lords for nefarious purposes. It was actually made by Belgian physician Paul Janssen in 1959 for legitimate medical uses in extreme pain management. It's 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. 2 decades later, China's economy started growing exponentially in the late 1970s thanks to economic reforms. Their pharmaceutical industry exploded at the time, growing 17% every year to becoming the 2nd largest in the world, because they were able to manufacture with lower labor costs and less strict regulations compared to Western countries. Precursor chemicals used in fentanyl were made with relative ease thanks to fewer restrictions. This was then exported to international markets, including the United States. Then at the same time, in 1988, fentanyl was approved for medical use inside the United States. It's treated as a Schedule II narcotic since it does have legitimate uses. However, this means it's not subject to the same scrutiny as substances like heroin, LSD, or even marijuana, despite being far deadlier. In the US during the 1990s and early 2000s, pharmaceutical companies marketed these opioids aggressively to healthcare providers, downplaying their addictive potential. Purdue Pharma, Johnson & Johnson, as well as others, misled healthcare professionals about the risks of their prescription painkiller OxyContin, contributing to the opioid epidemic in the United States. And so by 2019, fentanyl was in the top 300 most commonly prescribed medications in the US, with more than 1 million prescriptions. But by this point, the US government caught on to the problem and created new restrictions, making prescription opioids harder to legitimately obtain. In turn, some individuals who were already addicted turned to illicit opioids, which were cheaper and more accessible. Demand in the US was exploding, while at the same time, so was the supply in China, creating a perfect storm of these two parallel developments. So how did the US respond? I mean, this resulted in a drop of $1.5 trillion from the US economy, according to the US Congress's Joint Economic Committee. That's 7% of the annual GDP. In 2019, the Trump administration took the first steps to reverse course by applying political pressure, and as a result, China outlawed the shipment of all fentanyl products to the United States. The STOP Act was passed in an attempt to stem the flow of illegal fentanyl coming in through the mail. But despite all these efforts, fentanyl deaths continued to rise, and so did the amount of fentanyl seized by the DEA. China failed to enforce these controls. Like a Chinese finger trap, it seemed that the harder the US worked to pull away from Chinese shipments of fentanyl, the stronger the underground networks became. But is China purposely allowing this to happen? Chinese diplomats are quick to point out that they have a hard stance on drug crime. Just look at the fact that in China, drug-related convictions often carry the death penalty. So from China's perspective, the US policies and laws are way too lax. But that's not the whole story. Because when researchers looked deeper into the differences between anti-drug laws in the US and in China, they found large gaps, positioned to favor the export of fentanyl analogs. Ben Westhoff, author of Fentanyl Inc., and journalist who posed as a drug dealer from the United States in order to visit drug labs in China, explains during a Joe Rogan podcast.
In the US, we have this thing called the Federal Analog Act that bans all these drugs even before they're invented. But in China, they have to do it one by one by one by one. These chemists specialize in this window when something is banned in the US, but it's still legal in China.
Basically, it's like buying a knockoff brand cereal instead of the name brand stuff. Because of the loopholes available in Chinese law, synthetic drug manufacturers are able to operate legally in China, but the claim that China is actively funding the problem comes from this evidence.
Chinese companies showered with these types of government benefits include one called Wansheng. It receives them even while, by its own admission, it sells ingredients to make fentanyl, called precursors, all over the globe, including to the US.
So how does China keep themselves another step removed from the trade? The Mexican cartels were turned into a streamlined logistical network for a robust Chinese synthetic drug manufacturing industry. Chinese manufacturers are legally making and selling fentanyl products to the cartels that act as a logistical middleman to ferry large quantities of deadly drugs into American society. Then Chinese money launderers are facilitating the clearing of drug profits for an additional cut. Personally, I don't believe that the Chinese Communist Party set out with the intention of using synthetic drugs to poison and disrupt the United States. This was more likely a target of opportunity that emerged once the conditions were already ripe inside the United States. And it's important to note that China is not the only country involved in supplying this epidemic. The DEA also identifies India as an emerging supplier of fentanyl, analogs, and precursors. As early as 2016, Mexican cartel members traveled to China and India to set up ties and fentanyl distributors and inspect laboratories where they could order precursor and analog products. Experts also claim that the Chinese companies and chemists, when met with friction in China, moved to India to set up laboratories for fentanyl and other synthetic drugs. You might remember India was used by the British in the Opium Wars over a century ago to send opium into China. Sun Tzu, author of The Art of War and maybe the most well-known Chinese military philosopher, writes that the pinnacle of attack by stratagem is to manipulate the conditions on the battlefield so that you are victorious without needing to fire a single shot. When the leading cause of death for young Americans of fighting age between 18 and 45 is from fentanyl, it begs the question of how much this epidemic is being used to weaken the United States before the advent of any crisis. According to the Military Times, fentanyl deaths among troops more than doubled from 2017 to 2021. Veterans are disproportionately affected and are twice as likely as the general population to die from an opioid overdose. What are some ways to fix this? There are several steps that could be taken, but each solution has their own set of problems. First, the US could permanently place fentanyl-related substances into Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act to empower law enforcement's ability to bring those involved in trafficking and producing illicitly manufactured synthetic opioids to justice. Second, there's the option of military strikes against Mexican drug cartels and labeling them as foreign terrorist organizations to open up increased pressure here. Third, efforts to decrease US drug demand are important. The dynamics of fentanyl crisis involves various players, including Mexican cartels, Chinese manufacturers, and domestic demand in the United States, as well as companies in the US themselves. And yes, there are some interesting historical parallels here with the Opium Wars, but it's important to recognize the situation today is unique. China might not have started the opium epidemic in the United States, but they've clearly not let a good crisis go to waste. If you found something useful in this video, please hit the like and subscribe button so that more people can see this report. We spent months researching and writing this episode, so we greatly appreciate your support. I'm your average infantryman, Cappy. Thank you for watching Spare Parts Army.